Welcome to De-Risky Business, the economic security podcast from the Center for a New American Security in Washington, D.C. I'm your co-host, Emily Kilcrease.
And I'm your other co-host, Geoff Gertz. Today, we're talking about the presidential election and what that might mean for economic security. So we'll get into trade policy, including discussion of digital trade and technology policy, how both candidates would compete with China, and where U.S. partners and allies fit into both candidates' vision.
We digest the presidential debate just a little bit to see what the candidates think about economic security and where it fits into their economic and foreign policy. Though we'll leave the rest of the malarkey from the debate to the political pundits.
Enjoy.
All right, Geoff, what are we talking about today?
So today we're digging into a topic that's gotten no coverage in any media, the U.S. presidential election. So, I hope everyone's not sick of it already. We know there's lots of election media and content out there already, but we thought it would really be useful to dig in a little bit on, looking forward, what can we say about both the prospect of a Biden 2.0 sort of economic security policy toolkit, as well as what Trump would do. I think this is unique election for many reasons, but one reason is that we've got essentially two incumbents running here. So we can look at both of their previous records on these issues to ask where they might go in a second administration.
Yeah, and we should note for our listeners, so we're recording this on July 9th. As of the recording, President Biden remains the Democratic nominee for the president. Of course, we watched the debates, we rewatched the debates, we are tracking all of the conversations in the Democratic Party about whether or not President Biden should remain the candidate. But as of now, he appears quite committed to being the candidate. So we are going to treat this conversation as, what would Biden 2.0 look like? What would Trump 2.0 look like? At the end, we'll talk a little bit about the Democratic candidates who would potentially replace President Biden if he were to step down from the campaign, although, again, that appears unlikely as of this particular moment, although we'll see how the
give some real-time betting odds here. Has it at 62%, I believe. So we'll see, track it as over the course of the next hour.
There we go. Yeah, we'll have to re-record everything if things change in the next hour. But we will say if there is obviously a change in who the Democratic nominee is, we'll come back to this issue in a later podcast recording. But for right now, Biden and Trump, and what do we think the differences, or in many cases, the similarities might be in their economic security agenda in a second term.
Great. So maybe, Emily, let's start at like a very high level, big picture, kind of where do both of the candidates stand on kind of the broad picture of, U.S. global leadership, U.S. role in the global economy?
Yeah, one of the interesting things about looking at these two candidates is that their worldviews, their view on how the US fits into global geopolitics is fundamentally different. But when you actually look at the policies that they're implementing in the international economic sphere, there's a lot of consistency and a lot of similarities, right? So on the broader geopolitical question, it's quite clear that President Trump, with the America First agenda, is quite comfortable going it alone on the global stage, has put less emphasis on the need for partners and allies, has, again, in the broader geopolitical context, indicated less of a commitment to some of our longstanding alliances such as NATO, et cetera. Very much almost the exact opposite of President Biden, who has been trying to be in lockstep with allies and partners pretty much every step of the way. You see that, I think, most pronounced in the response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But once you step away from that broader geopolitical context, one thing we've noticed in our analysis so far is that there's a lot of similarity when it comes to the economics, right? So you've got both presidents really leaning hard on domestic investment, both presidents kind of backing away from neoliberal global trade policies. And so, that's what we're going to get into today in the conversation. Where do we see the particulars of these particular economic security policies going? Where are there differences, and where are there, in many cases, similarities?
Yeah, exactly right. Sort of, we know Trump has the America First rhetoric and the big push. Kind of Biden, meanwhile, came in saying sort of America is back, very much want to be open to the world, kind of engaging the G7, other venues. But as we'll see, as we dig into the details here, lots of similarities, though also some important differences and some nuances that we'll dig out. So, maybe let's start with just sort of the overall approach towards trade generally, looking both at trade with kind of primary sort of partners and allies, as well as multilateral institutions like the WTO. So maybe start kind of do a quick review of where was the Trump administration on its general approach to trade back in 2016.
Yeah, it's a good place to start. And we'll, as we go through the conversation, we will treat the rest of the world separate from China, right? So when we look at the Trump administration's the first term and the specific actions they took to kind of reset the trade relationship with everybody except China, there were a lot of notable actions, right? So one of the very first things that President Trump did upon coming into office was to pull the United States out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. So this was the huge Asia Pacific Trade Pact. It was a traditional comprehensive free trade agreement that Trump had campaigned against. Hillary Clinton, by the way, also campaigned against, despite initially supporting it as a Secretary of State. So pulled out of TPP, took a variety of tariff actions, notably the 232 actions that imposed tariffs on imports of steel and aluminum for national security reasons. One of the controversial aspects of those particular actions was that they were imposed not just on China, but on a global basis. So many of our partners and allies kind of chafed at the thought that they were having tariffs imposed in the name of national security on some of the goods coming into the US. Obviously, there was a lot of shaking up of the WTO under the Trump administration, some serious concerns that the Trump team expressed about the dispute settlement process. So basically, how do disputes between countries get resolved in the WTO system? They thought that there have been unfair rulings for a very long time, and so they blocked the seating of a full, appellate body panel. So basically, you can't adjudicate all the way up in the WTO system anymore. They objected to the appointment of the current WTO director. So a lot of actions taken to kind of push back against overreach, what they saw as overreach in the WTO. On the other side of the ledger, though, they did have a really big win with the renegotiation of NAFTA. And it's worth noting that USMCA, which was the renegotiated deal, is a trade agreement that had one of the largest margins of support in Congress historically. I sound very Trumpian when I say that. It was one of the most popular trade deals ever. But it is actually true when you look at the numbers that it got support from across the aisle in that trade deal as well. To bring in the debate briefly, so we're not going to spend a lot of time in this conversation talking about what everyone else is talking about with respect to the presidential debate, but there was one kind of offhand comment that Trump made in the course of the presidential debate about making a bunch of trade deals with Europe. Actually, not sure what he's talking about there. There were not trade deals with Europe under his first term, so kind of curious what that throwaway remark was or whether it really meant anything there. So, Geoff, am I missing anything? Was that basically the first term of the Trump
I think
administration?
that's it. I don't know. Did you mention chorus? There's a renegotiation of chorus that was, again, sort of relatively small changes from the previous version, but I think kind of shows a bit of the model of kind of a lot of bombastic rhetoric about tearing up trade agreements that often ended up with sort of relatively minor changes, but important, differences. Again, I think as you're right, sort of USMCA being the kind of big notable win that stood out there. And I remember at a time being the idea that sort of maybe this was the model for sort of new trade agreements going forward. They got big, broad, bipartisan success on the Hill. As we'll talk about in a moment, kind of haven't really seen that model got picked up and carried over elsewhere.
That's right. So, Geoff, what did we see under Biden's first term?
Yeah, so again, I think we'd start by saying a lot of continuity really from the Trump era. So we did not see any real effort to re-engage on TPP or re-enter that trade agreement in the Asia Pacific. Essentially kept a lot of the protections for steel and aluminum in place, some kind of changes from tariffs to tariff rate quotas, kind of honestly relatively technical questions. The end result is pretty much the same, that we've got pretty protected steel and aluminum sectors here in the United States. Really didn't see much else at the WTO, which again, I think is an area that a lot of partners and allies were a bit disappointed in. Thought that the US, the Biden administration would come in and say, all right, here's specifically what we want to see for the dispute settlement mechanism at the WTO, and maybe chart a path forward there. Didn't see that much progress there. One area to go back to USMCA as being a bit of a bright spot. I think we did see a fair bit under Biden on using the new enforcement mechanisms of the USMCA specifically for labor. They've got something called the rapid response mechanism that really kind of lets trade disputes get into kind of granular issues about sort of specific labor conditions at specific factories. That's something that the Biden administration has been interested in using a lot of. So I do think there's, something to be said there. But I think the big picture, if we step back, the Biden administration came in talking about a new worker-centered trade policy. It's going to be a kind of new paradigm for how we approach trade. I think realistically, if we look at what's been accomplished over the last 4 years, there's really not that many kind of points on the board for what a worker-centered trade policy really is. So as I said, we haven't seen kind of big changes at the WTO. The kind of proposals that we have seen, so IPEF is probably the biggest, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. This is not a official trade agreement in the sense of kind of a big comprehensive FTA. Instead, it's a, sort of somewhere in between a kind of memorandum of understanding, MOU, and a full trade agreement. Maybe it's a bit of a kind of hybrid approach. We're looking to kind of cobble together different ways of cooperating on international economic policies. There's some important work there on supply chains. I think there's trying to build out some work on investment that could be interesting. But overall, it's relatively low ambition. And then even from the kind of low ambitions part they started at, they really haven't been able to close out the actual kind of key trade pillar of IPEF. So I do think that's still definitely in the kind of work to be done category. Maybe one of the other big areas where we saw some action was going back to the steel and aluminum, efforts to negotiate with the Europeans on what they called a global arrangement on steel and aluminum, and really to kind of bring together some of the climate ambitions with trade policy. But we haven't successfully closed out those negotiations with the Europeans yet, so that's still ongoing. We kind of punted the deadline to that for another couple of years. So really, if you look across trade policy in the Biden administration, I think at best it's an incomplete grade.
Yeah, and interesting, you brought up the worker-centric trade policy, which has been a hallmark of the Biden administration. I think if you ask the Trump team, they would argue that their approach is also worker-centric, right? I mean, a lot of the trade policy was, and you can argue about whether it's had this effect or whether it's achieved its objective here, but I think their argument would be that they're also trying to recenter trade policy around domestic manufacturing and workers. It's not just about consumers. That was the old argument, right?
Yeah.
Of we need we need free trade, we need globalization. It's going to mean cheaper imports, and that's good for American consumers, which is true, right? Like if you look at the empirical evidence, that is an effect that the prior system has had. And I think what you're seeing from both the Biden team and the Trump team is saying we need to rethink about what we're putting at the center of our trade policy agenda, not just when it comes to China, but when it comes to the relationship with the rest of the world.
Yeah.
And that is the worker-centric trade policy. I think the Biden team coined it, but I think that spirit is very much animating, some of the Trump policy proposals as well. I think there's the big question, and this can get us into the okay, so what's next? What happens over the next 4 years? Is what does a structure look like for our trade policy that actually could achieve real benefits for American workers? And so let's get into that a little bit of what we've heard from both campaigns or just based on what we saw in the first terms and kind of how you can extrapolate from there. What would we expect under Trump 2.0 in a trade policy? Again, setting aside China, we'll get to China in the rest of the conversation. What would we expect from Trump 2.0? What would we expect from Biden 2.0?
Yeah. So, I mean, first to say, absolutely agree on the consumer point. I do think, and it's worth really pulling out because I think it's maybe a bit missed, but this is a big kind of philosophical change shared across both parties. And, to some extent, I think shared across a lot of sort of academics and others working in this area, which is sort of there has been this real focus on the consumer benefits of all these trade policies and a kind of broader approach to economic policy, really. And I think there is this switch to say, all right, we're going to take consumers away from being at the heart of these issues to focus on workers and kind of companies to an extent. And I think that sort of production and worker side relative to consumer, we've had a real kind of interesting rebalance of that's playing out in trade policy. Frankly, it's also playing out in competition policy, playing out across kind of a lot of different areas of economics. That watching how that unravels will be kind of central to either administration going forward. So I think if we look forward, I don't know, Emily, do you want to kind of jump in a little bit on, what have we seen so far from the kind of Trump campaign about where they saying they would want to go if they were reelected? I know we just had the Trump platform come out earlier this week, so maybe we can pull a little bit from there. But kind of what would a Trump 2.0 look like?
So, one of the bigger proposals that we have seen come out of the Trump campaign, of course, is the 10% tariff on goods from any country. So, separate from the 60% tariff on Chinese imports, we'd be looking at a 10% tariff on goods from any other country. This is one of the few economic security issues that came up squarely during the presidential debate. Former President Trump was asked a question by the moderators about whether the tariffs would have an impact on inflation. Of course, inflation is a big concern for voters. And tariffs could certainly worsen that, particularly if they're applied across the board at the 10% rate. The Trump response to that during the debate was that other countries will pay the tariffs. Now, of course, what we've seen so far, including from some of the US government reporting on the tariffs from the first Trump administration, is that that's not quite right. So it is typically the US consumers that will absorb the cost of those tariffs as the cost of the tariff is passed on to consumers once those goods cross the border. And so, in that sense, and President Biden did make this point during the debate, although I don't know how forcefully it landed, is that a 10% tariff is essentially a tax on US consumers. But that is one of the bigger proposals in the Trump campaign proposals, and I would take it quite seriously that he would intend to implement that. I think there's some open questions about what the legal authority would be to get you to that. It's obviously not consistent with the WTO. There's a question about whether we could use our Section 301 authorities to do that, but it would have to be at a pretty broad.
Section 301 on every country. Is that the
That's right,
pathway?
on every
Yeah.
country, right? So there's some mechanical questions that you would have to sort through to get to that 10% tariff. But I have no doubt that there's a plan to do that, and that they would see that as an important first step before they entered into any sort of actual attempt to deal with trade issues with any other country, right? Like the approach is very much gain leverage and then negotiate. So I think that's what we would expect to see.
Yeah, I think that sort of leverage point, again, go back to some earlier Trump policies, want to sort of, start by resetting the terms of the relationship. And then from that new reset point, which again, taking them on as where would be 10% tariffs across the board, then have the negotiation of where do we land. I think, we'll see how that goes. Another point that's interesting that's come up, a few times from the Trump campaign is talking about tariffs, not just for this leverage, not just for protecting workers, but also actually as a source of revenue. And I think that is something that, is even a more kind of throwback to a 1930s economic policy than we've seen in many areas. There's questions of like, oh, maybe we could replace the income tax with tariffs and stuff like that. Again, I think most economists are kind of pulling their hair out when they hear these things. But I think, even if we're not going to move to sort of large scale replacing taxes, Trump has talked about, well, maybe we could lower taxes a little bit with tariff coming in from revenue. Again, if you have a 10% tariff across the board, that is a serious chunk of change that is going into the treasury coffers. So it does sort of raise the question, where are we spending that money, or how are we sort of offsetting it through other tax cuts potentially?
Yeah, and this was a point that former President Trump did make during the debate of, Biden hadn't taken off the tariffs on Chinese imports because they were bringing in too much money, right? So clearly that's part of, well, it was a data point that came out during the debate about whether that's part of the thinking as well. The other aspect of a potential Trump 2.0 trade policy that's interesting to think about is the possibility of negotiating bilateral trade deals. They clearly don't like the regional pacts for a variety of reasons, but one of the reasons is that they don't think the United States has as much leverage in those sorts of negotiations. In his book, former USTR Ambassador Lighthizer is pretty explicit about that, in that, trade deals, the US is in a better position to get what it needs out of a trade deal when it's negotiating from a position of strength, and it can do that best in a bilateral sense. It's also worth noting that there were active bilateral trade negotiations under the first Trump administration. So, not just USMCA, but we were actively negotiating a free trade agreement with the UK. There were some early conversations around Kenya as well. So, that's an area to watch in terms of potential negotiation in a Trump 2.0. Now, having said that, I think all of these sort of bilateral deals, they're always going to have the China angle in the back of their mind, right? Like that was a big part of what was changed in USMCA, was trying to make sure that things like rules of origin, et cetera, were not being gamed by Chinese companies just trying to route through Mexico, for example. That is still a work in progress, as we've seen in the automotive sector. There were some interesting provisions put into USMCA around how the three parties would handle their own economic and trade relationships with China. I think all of that would have to be front and center in the context of any future bilateral trade negotiations. And I think there would also have to be a broader conversation around how do we think about export controls, and how do we think about all these other things that aren't typically in a traditional trade agreement. But I think if countries want to have a real conversation with the US under a Trump 2.0 about that, I think they're going to have to come to the table with kind of that broader portfolio in mind, and think about what a holistic relationship looks like that not just integrates with the US, but kind of helps kind of push back against the China challenge as well.
Great. Maybe that's a good point to sort of shift a little bit to, well, what would a Biden administration 2.0 look like? Because again, I do think obviously we've seen the big focus on economic security carrying over across the past two administrations. I do think as they are carrying forward their trade agenda, would likely bring that forward as well. You know, I think I'm not terribly optimistic. We'll see a rash of new trade negotiations under a second Biden administration. Again, if you look at what's happened in the first one, there's not sort of tons to hang your hat on there. I would expect they'd try to close out pieces already started. So again, both IPEF and the global arrangement on steel and aluminum, I'd look to those as sort of areas where we might be able to actually close things out. You know, the other area that I think is interesting, and again, I'm not sure I'm optimistic here, but would sort of, I think if there were a second Biden administration, it'd be great to see them really take this up, is some serious thought about WTO reform. That, you know, it's now been kind of quite some time that WTO hasn't really been working. I think there's just sort of open, lingering question of, all right, what is the WTO's role as a global institution in the current sort of economic order? I think it's a big outstanding question. And there's, you know, now that the US has sort of shocked everybody out of their kind of traditional support for WTO, maybe there is scope for some kind of bigger questions about how would we want to restructure WTO. So again, I haven't seen that coming out of the administration yet, but I think, you know, that'd be an area where if they wanted to do something, it'd be interesting to see them jump into that. Again, bringing the viewpoint of we want to be leaders in the world, we want to be working closely with our partners and allies. We know it's been an area of tension. You know, is there anything that can be done there?
Oh, you're such an optimist, Geoff. I don't know about the WTO. I think the U.S. needs to remain, committed to the WTO, but the idea of them putting a lot of political capital into reforming, it's such a big lift. And as you've said, we haven't actually seen a lot of progress during this Biden term. So I think they're going to continue to kind of, give lip service to the idea of WTO reform, as I think they should. They can't just discard the institution. It matters quite a bit for a lot of countries around the world, particularly smaller economies. But at the same time, I think if there's going to be any serious action on trade policy, it's going to happen. It's going to have to happen outside the context of the WTO, just because the WTO has gotten so unwieldy. But I do have to ask you, Geoff, are you optimistic that anything can happen on the trade pillar under the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework Agreement, right? I mean, that does seem like, in some respects, it was always doomed to fail, right? Because we weren't offering any tangible benefits to IPEF negotiating partners in order to get them to sign up to high standard labor and environment commitments. That is why there is domestic political opposition to moving forward with the IPEF trade pillar. Like, we haven't fixed that fundamental disconnect. So,
Yeah,
how
no,
optimistic?
exactly. I think that's the, you know, knot that we haven't untied here, right? Which is that there's a sort of domestic pressure, in my mind, kind of well founded to say, all right, we need to make sure our trade agreements have, you know, high standards, particularly labor and also environmental requirements in them. We want to have sort of race to the top, not a race to the bottom, this type of rhetoric. And I think this being a kind of important part of what does a worker centered trade policy really mean. I think, you know, real interest in sort of how do we say, all right, we care about workers here in the United States, but also workers around the world. We're kind of, you know, use trade agreements as a tool to boost labor. It's an interesting idea. But the kind of place that's always fallen apart is that the only way you're going to get the Vietnams of the world to sign on to, you know, demanding labor standards, which again would be a big change for the Vietnamese economy from where it is now, is if you really have something to offer them. And what Vietnam has been asking for us is access to our markets in terms of, you know, lowering tariffs on the kind of core kind of goods that Vietnam would like to export to the United States. As long as the United States is not willing to put that on the table, it's a very tough negotiation to sort of say, you know, yes, we're really going to twist the arm of Vietnam to sign up to something that's tough and binding on labor standards when we're not really giving them what they want. So that's the question. You know, are there ways forward? Again, you know, you talked about this idea of kind of bringing in some more of the economic security aspects into kind of a new kind of trade agreement. I think at the kind of higher level, maybe there's sort of scope there. Again, I'm not sure if sort of that's an IPEF or in some other configuration. I do think the question, you know, even if we're not going to be doing comprehensive free trade agreements, which is a lot of what our trading partners would want, but which I think are pretty clearly off the table now, you know, maybe there are more targeted things that we could do, you know, work on critical minerals. Can you kind of loop in a few other things? We'll get to kind of digital and tech in a moment. So, you know, I don't think it's a full glass empty situation here. But I do think, look, it's going to be an uphill battle for a Biden administration to have anything really kind of constructive and proactive on trade policy in a second administration.
Why start now? Um, should we move to digital trade? I mean, so this has been another area where, I mean, just to quickly recap, right? So there was some movement on digital trade issues under the first Trump term. You know, there was a gold standard digital trade tax that was included in USMCA. So we're talking about open data flows and protection of source code, et cetera. There was a mini deal signed with Japan that included digital trade obligations, but a vastly different picture under the Biden administration, of course, where there's been a real pullback from digital trade. And why are we seeing that? Why the pullback under the Biden administration? And then what do we think that means, like moving forward? Have the domestic politics just shifted to such an extent that like we're not going to do digital trade regardless of how the elections shake out, or do we think there's going to be some difference there?
You say we're just not going to have a trade policy on one of the most important sectors of our economy, Emily?
Possible. It is
It's
possible.
possible.
Not a good
Well,
idea, but possible.
yeah, I think, where the Biden administration, came down on all these things. So obviously this was initially quite a difficult part of the IPEF negotiations. So it was one of the issues, I don't think the only issue, but one of the issues that really hung up the IPEF trade pillar was progress on digital trade, and particularly on the cross-border data flows and data localization measures. So we had, first, the Biden administration kind of paused negotiations on these more kind of controversial aspects of digital trade in the IPEF context. After that, last October, we got the news that the USTR had essentially withdrawn US support for these provisions at WTO, kind of multilateral negotiations on digital trade, which has really kind of sparked a bit of a crisis in the digital trade community, saying, all right, where are we going from here? What is US policy? There's been, at least some effort to kind of have a rethink on, do we need to adjust any of our trade policy positions in order to accommodate kind of domestic regulatory rulemaking? I think that's the kind of overhanging question. I haven't seen tons of sort of productive paths forward. It doesn't seem like the Biden administration is in that much of a rush to get anything out on this at the moment. But it certainly is a kind of big outstanding question.
Yeah, I mean, one of the weirder parts of this conversation right now is, we're having this conversation about digital trade and whether that's going to constrain our ability to regulate our domestic tech industry. But the companies we want to regulate are US companies, right? So our trade obligations are not going to constrain our ability to regulate US companies. And like, I think we are both in agreement here that we absolutely need to do more regulation in the tech space. We absolutely need to get a handle on data security and the fact that data brokers can just sell all of our personal information overseas, you know, child safety online. There's a whole host of issues that we need to get a better handle on domestically. But what we've lost faith in doing, apparently, is trying to balance that with a broader open digital trade policy. And um, there's no indication that that's changing in a Biden administration, including in a Biden 2.0 administration. Would there be more openness in a Trump 2.0 administration? Maybe. I mean, there's been a little bit more of a sentiment of, we can beat up on our tech companies and try to do these digital trade deals. I mean, that was essentially the approach in the first term. Whether that shifted a little bit, not clear. There's obviously some criticism in Republican circles of some of the social media companies, et cetera, right? Like, this is not an uncomplicated space. So a little bit murky, I would say, in terms of how that would play out specifically in a Trump 2.0 administration. But I think there's more of an opening there than potentially under a Biden 2.0, at least if you're talking about kind of these traditional digital trade deals.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think, clearly the Trump administration, if there was Trump 2.0, would sort of still have a lot of the politics of being quite confrontational with big tech in the US. I think, frankly, whichever party is elected, I don't see that changing anytime soon. But I do think, maybe I'm a little bit more optimistic than you in a sort of second Biden administration that there might be scope to do something here. Again, I think, it has always been this question of like, all right, if we don't want to do the USMCA model, which, we can debate the strengths and weaknesses of the USMCA model on digital trade. I think, there are some arguments that was sort of overly tilted to the interest of big tech. I'm sort of happy to have that conversation. But, even if we don't want to do that, I do think we need an answer of what are we going to do? And again, quite frankly, this is one of those issues that so many of our partners and allies really want to see the US engage on, want to see US leadership on. Certainly countries, Australia, Singapore, Japan, the UK, all of these countries are coming to the United States saying, we want to see you engaged on digital trade. We have to have an answer. I think it made sense that the Biden administration did a kind of strategic pause, as it were, on some of these things. But certainly that pause cannot last another 5 years, right? So if we are looking at a second Biden administration, I think they're going to have something to say on this. And again, I think it's still an interesting question. What would a worker-centric digital trade policy look like? Let's get into the weeds and see the details of it. I think it'd be great to have that conversation. But certainly we're going to need to come up with something.
So you can't have a strategic pause for 8 years, only 4 years? Is that what you're saying? Okay.
I don't know.
Yeah.
How long did the Section 301 review take? That was
Oh, yeah. Well, yeah. So that was the rest of the world besides China, but we should probably move to China, given that that's going to be a huge focus in the trade policy space and in the economic security policy space more generally. So again, we'll do a quick recap of what we saw in the first administrations of both candidates, and then think a little bit about what that means moving forward. There's been a lot of action in this space, both from the campaigns and from Congress, in terms of how we should reset the US China relationship for both economic and security reasons. So, not going to spend a lot of time kind of reliving the glories of past days, but just to quickly recap, under the first Trump administration, there was, of course, a lengthy investigation under the Section 301 authorities into China's unfair intellectual property and forced technology transfer practices. That set the basis for the rounds of tariffs, which many refer to as the trade war, and ultimately led to the negotiation of the Phase 1 agreement with China, which was not a traditional trade agreement, but was an effort by the Trump team to take a big bite out of some of the big structural issues that have plagued the US China relationship for quite some time. There was, of course, also the purchase commitments associated with the Phase 1 agreement, which quickly fell apart during the COVID pandemic. And some novel enforcement provisions that were included in the Phase 1 agreement that to date have not yet been tested. So that was a lot of action, and a lot of tariff action in particular, against China in the first Trump administration. Also worth noting that there is quite a large uptick in the economic security space more broadly. So we saw just a huge amount of expansion of the export control toolkit during this time. So entity list designations went up. Notably, we saw the first kind of novel use of the foreign direct product rule, which was implemented on Huawei, essentially expanding on an extraterritorial basis the US export controls against Huawei. There was the initial effort to ban TikTok, although we can get into whether or not a Trump 2.0 would or would not, or would or would not ban TikTok, seems to change quite a bit. And there was significant expansion of the Committee on Foreign Investment in the US, or the investment screening authorities as well, under the Trump administration, which was paired with, I think, a really good effort to work with partners and allies on setting up their own FDI screening mechanisms. So that quick synopsis does not quite do justice to everything that happened. I will note that in a report that CNAS recently released called Disorderly Conduct, which is available on our website at cnas.org, we go into a lot more of the history of not just the Trump administration, but Biden, Obama, et cetera, going back essentially to the China's accession to the WTO. So if you're interested in getting into all of those nerdy details, we do have a full report on that. But that was
we
the
also have
big,
the launch event for that in a podcast feed a couple episodes back now, I guess. So check that
that's
out
right.
too.
That's right. So obviously under the Trump administration, the first time around, a huge effort to reset the terms of trade with China. What did we see in the Biden administration? More of the same?
Yeah, I mean, this is really the area, maybe more than any other, we'll talk about, where there's sort of real continuation across the two administrations, I think. So you see, general continuation of the China tariffs. Obviously, we just, recently had the kind of final release of the 4-year review of the Trump Section 301 tariffs. Result of that review, again, that, flew a little bit under the radar, but the kind of Biden kept all of the Trump tariffs in place, did not remove them, and then added a few additional tariffs on strategic industries, semiconductors, green tech, electric vehicles. So again, pretty similar on the kind of tariff trade front. Similarly, we had, again, to plug another great recent CNAS report. We have a recent report on sanctions by the numbers out that looks at the use of sanctions in the Biden and Trump administrations. We see that Biden kind of relatively continued the same trends, actually surpassed the Trump administrations in total designations of Chinese persons. There are 219 SDN designations and 303 entity list designations through the end of 2023, compared to under the Trump administration, a total of 205 SDN and 260 entity designations. So again, we see, if anything, the sort of underlying trend of more action against China just continuing here. Similarly, we see certainly the TikTok ban that President Biden signed into law after it was passed by Congress. So again, continuation there. We'll sort of get into the future of that in a moment. The other piece we saw here that I think is also quite notable is really sort of building out the toolkit for addressing the national security and economic security risk with China. So in particular, we saw the development of the outbound investment tools. So this was executive order issued last summer. The Treasury Department is just now in the midst of sort of finalizing those rules that will restrict certain U.S. investments into key technology sectors in China that have national security implications. Also saw action on data security, so big restrictions on certain sensitive U.S. persons' data flowing to China as well as Russia and other adversary countries. Similar, possible action on connected vehicles. We talked to this a little bit with Alan Estevez here a few weeks back on sort of the future of, how might the U.S. restrict Chinese components into connected vehicles and what are some of the data security and national security risks there. But I think really, by and large, if you look at the Biden administration's approach to China, it's been continuing and, if anything, kind of intensifying, escalating where the Trump administration started with this.
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment, right? I mean, a lot of this was just kind of the natural evolution of these policy tools. If you start to use, for example, FDPR, then you've got a tool in the toolkit, and you're just going to keep on using it more if you think it works. And I think that's a lot that explains a lot of what we saw under the Biden administration, and I think will explain a lot of what we would see under either candidate in a future administration. There are some notable differences, though, right, which we should get into. So in the Trump in a Trump 2.0, I think there's some pretty sharp differences on some specific issues, right? So there's the 60% proposed tariff on Chinese imports that is very much like a harder push towards full decoupling from China. And so if you look at, for example, Ambassador Lighthizer book, No Trade is Free, it's clear that they believe there's some unfinished business in the relationship with China. 60% tariffs are part of, again, trying to reset the relationship to make them fair, the terms of trade fair for the United States, address the trade deficit. And if that brings China back to the negotiating table for additional negotiations, maybe a phase two agreement, great. But I don't think that's the only objective for a 60% tariff. Now, once you actually implement that, like what would that do to inflation? I think is a very fair question. What would that do to supply chains? Again, a very fair question. I think the Trump team, as they're looking at it, they see those as adjustment costs, right? Like part of the incentive of these tariffs is to try to get companies to take painful short-term adjustment costs to get those supply chains out of China. So I think a little bit of disruption and friction is something that they're quite comfortable with. Economists would argue that it's a little bit more than a little bit of friction, though, to be fair. The other piece about this whole tariff debate, though, that we should point out is this question about whether we should revoke China's most favored nation status under the WTO, or revoke their PNTR, or their permanent normal trade relations status, which is enshrined in law. And it's a question that we should think about, right? I mean, it was something that was mentioned in the House Select Committee's report as their number one recommendation. We also need to recognize that our trade with China is not currently being conducted under WTO terms, right? Because of all of the existing tariffs under the 301 investigation, which were expanded under the Biden team. So we're already not, trading on WTO terms with China. And I think it's a question of whether we go through with a formal revocation of PNTR, and then what do we go to? What are the tariff codes that we would go to? Is it just the 60% across the board? Do we try to do something a little bit more differentiated, et cetera? I think that's the debate that we should be having, and maybe we would have under a Trump 2.0, although clearly what's on the table is 60% across the board as a kind of a blanket tariff. The other The other piece I want to mention too, I mean, again, kind of referencing Ambassador Lighthizer book, which is a terrific guide for anyone who actually wants to understand how the Trump team is thinking about this. He did us the favor of writing it all down in a book. Is their view on investment and Chinese investment in the United States? And he says clearly in the book that one of his regrets was that we were constrained when we were looking at Chinese investment in the United States of only blocking deals that had a national security implication. And so, is there a logic in a Trump 2.0 of looking at a broader investment screening sort of review, a broader national interest test? It's not a crazy idea. Canada does that, Australia does that. It's not how the US does it. The US has always done on a more narrow national security basis. Clearly, Ambassador Lighthizer, as he wrote in his book, would like to see a broader mandate there. I would question whether the juice is worth the squeeze when you look at the Chinese FDI numbers in the US, which have really just fallen off a cliff in recent years, in large part because of CFIUS action. Maybe there's a little bit more space to do that in the venture capital space, but I would expect that that would be part of the policy push that we would see in a second Trump administration.
Yeah, I think that is exactly right. I'd say, I mean, again, as you say, it's not a crazy idea to sort of introduce a national interest test. Frankly, if you look at the Biden administration on sort of some of the Nippon Steel issues, we may be in a better place if we had a sort of national interest test where we could say, we've decided it does not meet the national interest, rather than kind of only having the sort of only tool available to us, a national security tool. We're, a more complicated set of issues, which we can kind of get into the future. But I think that, that's an idea that frankly makes sense, kind of China context or otherwise. The one other thing we do need to come back to, TikTok, again, everyone's, favorite short video app here. So look, the TikTok,
Not everyone's favorite. I should be
not
clear.
everyone's favorite.
Not
That should
everyone's
be
favorite.
fair. Their official CNAS policy, not to use TikTok. I don't know. Um, Look, we're not going to recap the whole TikTok saga now. Maybe we'll kind of come back to this in a future episode at some point. But I do think it's worth noting, right, the kind of Trump position here. So obviously, he came out, whatever it was, 5 years ago now, saying, trying basically to ban TikTok. That failed in the courts. There was a simultaneous effort to maybe sell off TikTok to Oracle, or I think Walmart was floated as a potential buyer at one point. And, again, who knows, some of the reporting on kind of Trump really trying to do sort of transactional, kind of get the deal done sort of negotiations here. Obviously, since then, we've had a sort of steady increasing drumbeat of pressure on TikTok in the United States under the Biden administration, really culminating in the law that was passed by Congress a few months ago now that Biden has signed, which kind of puts TikTok on the clock to say either you need to sell or you will effectively be banned. That case is now working its way through the courts, so we'll see kind of exactly where that ends up with. But the kind of interesting piece of this is that, in recent months, as the kind of TikTok ban's gotten a bit more real, can we say, we've seen Trump come out and say, oh, actually, I don't want to ban TikTok anymore. And that he is, putting some sunlight now between his position on TikTok and Biden's. So again, I think it's a really interesting question. Where exactly would a second Trump administration come down on a kind of possible TikTok ban? Is ByteDance kind of hoping that Trump wins to kind of buy them a bit more space here? It's an interesting question. And maybe, so there's both the sort of specifics of the TikTok deal, but I also do think it points to, a bigger issue, which is that there's a lot more uncertainty on where a Trump China policy goes, specifically because he has a sort of transactional deal maker approach, where I feel, so I think while you see a lot of similar national security concerns in both the first Trump administration as well as in the Biden administration on, specifically tech policy in China, I think under a Trump administration, it's a bit easier to imagine some negotiating away of some of these concerns that the Biden administration has drawn pretty clear lines about that they kind of will not negotiate on. So I do think, whether it's TikTok, whether it's sort of future of Huawei, ZTE, who knows what else, I do think the idea that sort of Trump will come in and negotiate a new deal is always sort of lingering out there. Whereas I think a bit more in the Biden administration, the kind of approach to China is fixed.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I mean, there's another distinction here in terms of just the nuts and bolts of trying to implement these policies, these anti China policies, which is that the Trump and Biden teams take a very different view on the US ability to do this alone or the importance of trying to coordinate with partners and allies on China's strategies, right? I think there was a heavy push towards unilateral measures under the Trump administration. I think they believe that the US can do it and can do it effectively. I personally don't agree with that. I think over time, unilateral policies will become less effective. I think part of their perspective has been informed by just candidly the prior difficulties in getting some of our partners to align with us, particularly in Europe. I think they've been highly frustrated with some of their prior efforts. And so they've decided that the best, most effective approach to take urgent on what they see as a to take action on what they see as an urgent national security and economic security issue is just to do it and hope that eventually allies will come along. Now, clearly, that's not the Biden team's approach. They put a lot of energy into setting up different dialogues and forums, the Trade and Tech Council with the EU, for example, to try to get alignment and to give these other countries credit. I do think we have seen more hardening, particularly in Europe, but also in some of our key Asian allies, Japan, et cetera, towards China. And I think it's hard to overstate the impact that China's support of Russia has had on European attitudes towards China. Now, there's a lot of work to do. There's still a lot of daylight between where the U.S. is and where allies and partners are. But I think under a Trump 2.0 administration, it's really going to be incumbent on U.S. partners and allies making the case that they see China as a strategic competitor, they are committed to taking action, and that they want to work with the United States. Otherwise, I think the Trump team's initial inclination is just like, you guys are always kind of weak on this, so we're going to do what we need to do on a unilateral basis.
Yeah, I think that's
Is that
exactly
right?
right.
Yeah.
I think, what we see is that, under the Biden administration, there's a lot of effort, particularly through the G7, working with the EU and the TTC, other venues, but, to frame US approach to China as being not just unilateral, but about a much bigger set of like-minded interests and values. And, particular on the kind of check, and in particular on the China tech competition issues, you see the rhetoric around small yard high fence. You see the rhetoric around de-risking, not decoupling, which initially was actually a European Union kind of. I think it was President von der Leyen that started saying that then got kind of adopted by the Biden administration and sort of fed back into the international conversation to really say, look, this is not the United States kind of throwing a temper tantrum and tearing up the global economy. This is, we want to work, carefully and methodically with our partners and allies to take targeted measures to de-risk our economy from China. I do think you have to ask, kind of, if a Trump comes back into power, presumably we won't necessarily see the same kind of rhetoric around, oh, we don't want to decouple. Frankly, 60% tariff sounds a lot like decoupling to me. So it'll really be kind of a question for partners and allies to figure out, all right, strategically, how are they thinking about how they respond to this new U.S. approach? How do you both sort of show the United States that you take seriously the real risks that there are from China? Well, also, be blunt, I'm sure if we saw Trump come in, there will be a lot of other, even like-minded partners and allies that are looking at de-risking from the United States too.
So, another area that we haven't touched on directly, although this did come up in the presidential debate, was the question of industrial policy, which is kind of about China, kind of not about China, but kind of all about China, depending on which sector we're talking about. And there's been a series of really high profile initiatives from the Biden administration on industrial policy. So, the Chips and Science Act, of course, trying to rejigger global semiconductor supply chains so we have more domestic manufacturing in the United States. We had the Inflation Reduction Act, really trying to spur clean energy production and manufacturing of clean energy technologies in the United States. We had the infrastructure investment, et cetera. That was a core part of Biden's China strategy about invest, align, compete. So this is the invest part of that, really trying to shore up some of those critical supply chains and sectors in the United States. I think it's a bit up for grabs if it's if it's a Biden 2.0, I think all that stuff continues, right? If it's a Trump 2.0, I think it's a little bit more up for grabs. My sense is that with the chip sector and the chips investments, there's enough of a national security argument that has enough bipartisan support that those investments will stick and that that policy would be continued. I mean, I think it would be disastrous, candidly, from a national security perspective if we pulled back from that, right? Like we do need to rebuild some of that capacity in the United States or in some of our close allies. But if we're spending U.S. taxpayer money, it's going to be to build it in the United States. Where it's much more contested, of course, is in the clean energy space in the presidential debate. I think former President Trump referred to this as the Green New Scam and emphasized his commitment to all energy sources, but particularly oil and gas resources in the United States as a way of securing U.S. energy independence. So, what do you think, Geoff? Do we think clean energy investments are go away under a Trump 2.0?
It's a big question. Look, I mean, maybe first just on the chips, I think it's exactly right. I think, maybe there'll be some tweaks at the margins of policy. There's been some reporting on how much the Biden administration is focusing on sort of worker commitments in these contracts for the new fabs and stuff like that. Maybe those get tweaked, but by and large, that is a big, broad, bipartisan policy. I think that's a consensus. I don't see that going anywhere. The energy side, as you say, is definitely more complicated. I think things that are framed very clearly in sort of, this is good for the environment, things that kind of get caught up in the kind of Green New Scam sort of branding here, will be under more pressure. I think the interesting thing will be how much do any of those industries really pivot to being kind of part of the broader geopolitical competition, that we do not want to fall behind China in the key new strategic sector of, important renewable energy, not because of the climate change hoax, kind of quote unquote, but because this is going to be cheap, abundant, new energy that's going to be critical, new batteries that are powering our militaries, et cetera, kind of critical minerals. There's a lot of things that you can loop into a more, let's say, kind of harder edge geopolitical lens, where I think kind of the money will likely keep flowing. So it'll be interesting to see quite how that evolves in a potential Trump 2.0.
Yeah, definitely an area to watch. I think the Trump 2.0 would have no problem blocking some of the Chinese investments in the US or licensing of Chinese clean energy technology, right? I mean, they've been very clear on that point. But whether they would match kind of those defensive policies with anything more affirmative or just kind of let those stand, particularly if there's starting to be some vested interest developed around those
Yeah.
clean energy tech investments, I think is very much an open question and an area to watch.
Once you start handing out the money, it's harder to take it away. So we'll see.
That's right. All right. So, we've been talking about policy issues, but obviously, a huge part of how any of this all gets implemented is the personnel question. So, should we spend a minute on that, just thinking through who the key appointments would be under a Biden 2.0 and a Trump 2.0 and what we should be looking for in those sorts of signals moving forward?
Sure. Washington's favorite parlor game here. So
It's fun. We should start a betting pool on this. Uh, I mean, so I think, under a Trump 2.0, I think the big one to watch, of course, is the VP selection. There's been a range of names indicated so far. And I'm not going to put my thumb on the scale here. I mean, I think one interesting candidate that uh, would signal quite a bit on the economic security front, of course, is Senator J.D. Vance from Ohio, who's been very much aligned with Trump on some of the economic security policies, very clearly opposed to the Nippon Steel deal, very supportive of a more kind of inward looking economic policy focused on domestic manufacturing, et cetera. I think if he remains one of the leading contenders or if he is, in fact, the VP pick, I think then that's just an indication that all of the more kind of protectionist impulses that we've been talking about under a Trump 2.0, like they're going to get intensified and they're going to have kind of a VP attention to it because that's been a core part of what Vance has been talking about as well, particularly coming from Ohio, which is an important state for these issues. The other key appointment to watch, I think, is Ambassador Lighthizer, who, of course, in the first Trump administration was the U.S. trade representative, was really a leading voice on a lot of those trade policy efforts. The question is, does he come back in? And if he comes back in, where does he go, right? Would he go back to USTR? Would he be appointed as the Treasury Secretary, which would be interesting to watch, right? That would give him a whole new set of tools to work with. He would have the sanctions authority. He would then have CFIUS and the investment security authority. And, as we said before, that was an area where he indicated he feels like he's got some unfinished business or was a little bit frustrated with his set of authorities under the first administration, right? So being at Treasury might give him some flexibility to address those. So I think that'll be a key one to watch in terms of, how do we think that some of these specific policies will actually be implemented and what are the particular policy levers that would be pulled. But what do you think about the Biden team?
So, hard to say on the Biden team. I think the starting point is that there's been real stability under the cabinet in the first administration. So, unlike in the Trump administration where there's sort of lots of turnover, both at the White House and across the agencies, under Biden, you've seen, very little turnover. So that does kind of beg the question of, what might a reshuffle for a second term look like? Hard to say. I think it'll be very interesting to see where Gina Raimondo ends up going. I think she's somebody who, as head of commerce, has gotten kind of quite good reviews, and people are kind of pretty impressed with the job she's done there. I think lots of interest in kind of keeping her involved. So, possibly move over to Treasury would be interesting to watch. Um, also another possible name for Treasury is Lael Brainerd, who kind of initially came up when Biden was first going in as a possible Treasury candidate. She's currently the head of the National Economic Council at the White House. Again, I think if you saw either Raimondo or Brainerd there, both of them have maybe been a bit sort of tougher on China than sort of where Treasury has traditionally been in Democratic administrations. So that might be something to watch. I think, turning over to USTR, kind of big question of whether Catherine Tai will stay on. I don't know the answer to that. I think, but that certainly will drive a lot of sort of where trade policy in a Biden 2.0 would be going. I think maybe stepping back a little bit from specific names, there's kind of a question of, within the Democratic coalition for trade policy, you have both certainly a very strong kind of pro-labor, a bit more kind of protectionist, you could say, approach on trade, as well as some sort of traditional, again, looking back to sort of older sort of Obama-Clinton times, a more kind of pro-business, sort of pro-traditional free trade, pro kind of low tariffs and openness constituency. I think the kind of question is sort of who's left in that sort of latter constituency, and are any of them going to get jobs in a next Biden administration? One interesting data point on this: there has been sort of some recent news, which is that earlier this year, the Biden administration had announced they were going to nominate Nelson Cunningham, who's the head of McCarty Associates, and kind of, I think, generally would fall into that sort of traditional, more kind of pro-business side of the ledger, to be deputy USTR. But after some significant pushback in Congress, particularly from Sherrod Brown, they announced that they were withdrawing that nomination. And I think Nelson Cunningham's now headed to state to be an advisor there. So, if that's a preview for sort of where some of the kind of confirmation fights may go, it looks like it's sort of still quite likely to be sort of dominated by the more sort of pro-labor side of the Democratic coalition there.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, you've got a president in President Biden who has claimed he's the most pro-labor president ever. He stood on strike lines, right? I mean, I don't see any of that changing. And if that's kind of what is the guiding light in the trade policy, I think you can expect to see a lot of the same and that the personal appointment would reflect that.
Exactly.
All right, so should we get into the touchiest subject, but the one of the most intense debate, which is what happens if Biden does drop out? I mean, again, recording on July 9th. As of the start of this recording until right now, he's still in the race, but that could change. But we thought it'd be helpful just to touch really briefly on a couple of the big candidates and whether we would expect any of those other candidates to really cause a big shift in any of the trade or economic security issues that we're talking about. And of course, the obvious one that we do start with here is the Vice President Kamala Harris. So, Geoff, what do you think? Any changes there?
So, probably not really. I think looking, again, we don't have sort of tons to draw on sort of say here, but I think what we can say is that it looks like all of her policies are kind of pretty much closely aligned with Biden's. Obviously, she's been in the White House these 4 years, so kind of will be closely associated with all those. I don't see huge change of that. Again, she's sort of broadly an internationalist, kind of similar to Biden. Again, I think kind of, focus on the transatlantic relationship. Again, sort of the similar language around China about de-risking, not decoupling. So I would think probably pretty similar there. Maybe we'll throw out a name that maybe we'll see, slightly different, kind of a bit further down the betting odds list at the moment, but has gotten, mentioned before, is Gavin Newsom, the California governor. So would he have any difference, Emily?
Yeah, I mean, I think when you look across the governors that are potentially in contention or those who have had large state roles, right? So we've got Gavin Newsom, we've got Gretchen Whitmer, who has, to be clear, explicitly said she is not a candidate and does not want to be a candidate and supports Biden, right? I think they have a little bit of a different view from the state level on the economic relationship with China. They've been a bit more supportive of economic engagement. We've seen the reporting, of course, that Newsom was in Beijing and was trying to make sure that California's relationships with China remain robust. And so I think that sort of perspective, which can make a lot of sense from a state level, there would be some friction in translating that to a national level policy position. It's not quite in step with where we've seen the Biden-Harris team go so far on the China issue specifically.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. I think it is a real interesting, sort of generalizable point here, which is that, governors, sort of mayors, those are focused more on the local politics, often less hawkish, particularly towards China, more focused on the kind of practical domestic economy issues, less about kind of foreign policy ideology questions. And so again, particularly on the sort of China angle, it'll be interesting to see if some of those governors do rise in prominence, how, if at all, they might kind of adjust their approach on the national stage.
Yeah, and lots more candidates that we could get into, but we'll leave it there for now. Of course, if President Biden does drop out of the campaign, we'll come back to this issue and do a deeper dive on all of these candidates moving forward. But for now, I think that's enough. We've covered a lot of ground and a lot of really meaty subjects today. So thanks, Geoff, and thanks to Andrew for his help, Andrew Spafford on our team, who helped do research and produce this event as well.
Great, wonderful. Thanks, Andrew. Always happy talking with you.
All right, take care.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to De-Risky Business, an economic security podcast from the Energy, Economics, and Security Program at the Center for a New American Security. Have any questions or comments? Get in touch at deriskybusiness@cnas.org. The nerdier, the better. And find us wherever you get your podcasts every other Thursday.